more about each person he met and every issue he tackled. So I wanted to come to the floor today and express this tribute to a public life well lived and to offer my condolences to his wife, Pat, his children, Kate and Edward, his brothers, and his grandson. Mr. President, I ask consent to include, following my remarks, the New York Times story about Doug Bailey's death and Judy Woodruff's blog about his passing. It has afterwards lots of comments from other people, and I've not seen a blog in a long time where all the comments are positive. Usually that's not the case.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor, and I notice the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Waiting for a senator to come to the floor for general speeches. There's going to be 2 votes scheduled for 5:30 today on 2 judicial nominees. The votes will be followed by debate on the immigration bill. And while we wait, we'll show you a portion of this morning's Washington Journal. This segment has guests discussing the latest in the NSA surveillance programs in the case against Edward Snowden.
Yesterday, the White House sent Chief of Staff Dennis McDonough onto the Sunday shows to talk about some of the claims made by the NSA leaker Edward Snowden. To discuss the latest on this story, we're joined by Juan Zarate, a former Deputy U.S. National Security Advisor in the George W. Bush administration, who now works at the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in D.C. Mr. Zarate, what is the White House strategy right now in handling this NSA leak?
Well, John, good morning. It's great to be here with you. I think first and foremost they want to get a handle on the damage that this leaker has done. So the intelligence community is looking at the information that he's downloaded, that he has with him. The fact that he made his way to Hong Kong and is in Chinese territory is problematic because it appears that what he's doing is he's using the information he has as potential leverage. It starts to look like a spy scandal versus a whistleblower context. So the White House, I think, first and foremost is worried about what he may have in his possession and the way he can share it with the Chinese. But secondly, and I think you saw this in Dennis McDonough's appearance, I think they're trying to explain a bit more clearly what this program is and the checks and balances built into it that provide the protections on privacy and civil liberty that has been so much a part of the controversy. And I think being more open about that is what you saw Dennis McDonough try to do yesterday on the Sunday Talk Show.
And what's the right balance to strike here, in your opinion, as far as explaining aspects of this program to a concerned public, but also ensuring that other classified information isn't released?
Well, I believe you take an oath to hold this information classified. It's classified for a reason. It should be classified. So what Snowden did, I think, is wrong. We can talk a little bit more about that if you want. But now that it's out, I think the administration should and probably has a responsibility to be as open as possible, not only about how the program works, but about what the checks and balances are. I think most people don't have a clear sense of the seriousness with which, in particular, the National Security Agency takes its role in looking at information, in particular information that may be about American citizens. There are lawyers devoted to that. There are strict rules. There are Inspector General reports and audits. And I think it's very important for the American public to understand how it is that their government is using this information. I think it's also important, John, because we've entered a new era, right, a new era of big data, where the government has access and is retaining more and more data. And the reality is we haven't had much of a public debate about what the government can or should be looking at in that context with all the new technologies at play, and while sort of shifting standards on reasonable expectations of privacy continue to unfold. And so I think this is a very important moment for the administration to be fairly open about what this program is and how the protections on privacy and civil liberties work.
We're going to open up the phone lines to callers for questions and comments about this issue. The numbers are on the bottom of the screen there. But as folks are starting to call in, Mr. Zarate, tell folks a little bit about your background and your experience with some of these programs that we're now talking about.
Sure. I started as a young prosecutor in the pre-9/11 days as a terrorism prosecutor and worked on the USS Cole case, the embassy bombings case in East Africa. I was at the Treasury Department during 9/11 and was responsible for terrorist financing and anti-money laundering systems, and so we built out a lot of the track the money, follow the money systems and programs that are now in place. And then in 2005, I joined the White House as President Bush's deputy assistant for counterterrorism. I was the deputy national security advisor, and so my job was to oversee the strategy and the implementation of our strategy on counterterrorism and other transnational threats. And so I was in the middle of a lot of these debates, in the middle of a lot of these questions as to how you balance these issues. And John, one episode I think is instructive here, and I think people have forgotten this, is that in 2006 you not only had the leak of the NSA wiretap program, the surveillance program, you also had the New York Times leak of the Treasury's terrorist financing tracking program, which, if you recall, caused a bit of controversy. But at the end of the day, the public editor for the New York Times issued a mea culpa saying it was a mistake to actually publish that story, in part because the program was legal, it was effective, and was being controlled to the extent that privacy and civil liberties were actually being protected. And that's a program that I think should have been viewed as an example of how to do this, where you had audits from the outside, you had control from the company as to how the information was used, and a very constricted use of a mass amount of data. I think that was a great example for how we should proceed with these types of cases and programs.
Are you expecting to see that from The Guardian or The Washington Post, who were the first to publish these stories from Snowden's leaks? Do you think they made a mistake?
Well, I think Snowden, first and foremost, made the mistake, right? He had the obligation. He took the oath. It's a problem. It's illegal, and he should not have done it. I don't expect to see a mea culpa from The Guardian, certainly, and certainly not from The Washington Post. The press has an obligation to publish things, but I think they also have a responsibility to do it responsibly. And I think, from what I know, I think The Washington Post has actually held back on publishing other details that they may have. Look, all of this is part of an important debate. How does the government access and use data, in particular for national security purposes, but potentially, how do we ensure that it's not being abused? And we can't simply, take the president's word for it. We have to know what mechanisms are in place, and we have to hold people accountable, not just the president, but the Congress, and understand as well how the FISA court, the court established in 1978, how it works and how the oversight is happening.
We're talking with Juan Zarate, is a former Deputy National Security Advisor for Counterterrorism. Our phone lines are open if you want to call and ask questions. But one issue I wanted to ask you about, the White House sent its Chief of Staff on the Sunday shows yesterday, and one of the things he did was cast some doubts on some of the claims made by Edward Snowden. Do you believe all the claims that Edward Snowden made in his leaks?
I think some of what he was saying in that interview with The Guardian appeared to be hyperbole. The idea that he could, at the touch of a button or the flip of a switch, wiretap anyone he wants, including the President of the United States, just is probably not accurate. And even if he did have that access, that would be illegal. he would be held accountable and in trouble. And so, again, I think some of what he's claiming is hyperbole, but the reality is, and this is worthy of a good bit of introspection, he had access to a lot of information, some of which probably shouldn't have, and now has downloaded it and has it on Chinese territory, which causes a lot of concern.
We'll open the phone lines up. Dennis is from Winchester, Virginia, on our Republican line. Dennis, you're on with Juan Zarate.
Yes, good morning, gentlemen. Thank you for your time. I just have a quick comment or two. The President of the United States, Mr. Obama, ran on a platform of transparency. And all of this stuff, all these scandals just flies in the face of it. He's a liar and needs to be impeached. I can't believe the American public is standing back and letting all this happen and not just raising hell and throwing him out of the office. That's really all I had to say. I don't understand why the American people are allowing this to happen.
Juan Zarate, talk about the public reaction.
Well, I think it's an interesting point Dennis raises, because I think one of the interesting parts and perhaps shocking elements of this story is not necessarily that the government is looking at this kind of data. You've seen a lot of stories in the last couple of days, a lot of commentary saying, look, we know that the government's looking at this. There's been this debate since 2004. The FISA Reauthorization Act, the Modernization Act in 2008 was precisely about this. And so what is the hullabaloo about? Well, I think part of that politically and publicly is the fact that this is happening during the Obama administration and is a program that started in the Bush administration and has expanded aggressively in terms of surveillance under the Obama administration. An administration that came in seemingly bent on retreating from a lot of the Bush-era counterterrorism policies. And John, as I said when I left the White House in 2009, you were going to see fundamental continuity in our counterterrorism policies and practices. And I think you've seen that. You've seen that with the targeted killings and those campaigns that the Obama administration has accelerated, the long-term preventive detention, which is symbolized and represented in Guantanamo, and now in this, the revelation of surveillance programs continue apace. And so I think for the American public, there's a bit of a disjuncture between what the Obama administration promised when they came into office in 2009 and the reality of the continuity of those counterterrorism policies.
On the surveillance issue specifically, did you have any concerns during your time in the Bush administration about the expansion of that, and how did you feel about the program when you left?
Well, I can't speak to what I knew on a classified basis, but I will tell you we constantly grappled with this balance. To suggest that the Bush administration didn't worry about these issues is frankly not to look at the record and certainly not to understand the evolution of these programs. The program I mentioned, the Terrorist Financing Tracking Program, was fairly unique in that regard. It started in 2001, and from 2001, 2002, 2003, when I was at the Treasury, we embedded in it the privacy and civil liberties controls and practices, and over time made it even stricter. And so our access to the data was constricted over time, monitored by the very company that was providing us the data, monitored by outside auditors, monitored by our own internal IG and practices, and at the time it became public, also then monitored by the European Union, which sent their own expert, Jean-Louis Bruguière, the famous French magistrate judge, to come over and verify that we were doing what we were saying. So there are ways of striking that balance between security and privacy, and I think what we're recognizing now is that there's a continuity of this, an evolution as to how you do it, and frankly there needs to be more of a public debate. We did it in the Bush administration, perhaps not perfectly, but I think every administration has to grapple with these balances.
USA Today has been holding a NSA whistleblower roundtable with security experts. Here's their coverage in today's paper. And one of the questions that they ask to these security experts is, did foreign governments, terrorist organizations get information that they didn't have already because of these leaks by Edward Snowden?
Well, I think they certainly, I think there's a problem with assuming sort of common knowledge among all terrorist actors. Certainly the bin Ladens and the Ayman al-Zawahiris, the leaders of al-Qaeda, once knew and certainly do know the kind of surveillance that's underway, and their security practices are very sophisticated. But the reality is the terrorist threats that we face now are more disjointed, more fractured. You have younger individuals who may not necessarily know the kinds of practices and modalities that are used by the intelligence community to track their communications or to track their movements. I would say sort of the general notion that government services are looking at communications, not a big deal. I think we know that. But I think the problem is in exactly how it's done. And I think that's where the U.S. government gets very worried, where sources and methods are revealed. And then you see the sophisticated actors in particular start to adapt around that knowledge. And I think everyone who says, you know, these leaks don't really matter because everyone knows and assumes, I think folks overestimate the amount of detail that our terrorist adversaries know about exactly what we're doing.
Juan Zarate is currently a senior advisor with the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington, D.C. He's taking your questions on this NSA leaker story this morning. Teresa's up next from Columbus, Ohio, on our independent line. Good morning, Teresa.
Hi. I've been very interested in watching all of these political issues, including the NSA, and it's starting to make me feel that the Republican Party is sort of dumbing down America. You know, why aren't we fixing what needs to be fixed in this country, and why aren't these congressmen and senators doing their job? And especially being from a military background, my dad served, my brother served, my husband served. I don't understand why we can't take care of business instead of just pitching fire at our president, whom a lot of Americans won't even give him the respect of President Obama. When I hear Mr. Obama coming from certain networks, I just have to shake my head and say, you know what, he might not be your guy, but we still got to take care of America. And we have children out here that are living with their parents until they're 30 years old. We have disabled people that can't get care. We have children being killed because we won't do a mental health registry. And as a caregiver of a mentally ill son who's 29 years old, I spend every day with him. There are no services for him.
Juan Zarate, are we spending too much time on this NSA issue? Has it taken up too much of the bandwidth on Capitol Hill and the White House the last 2 weeks?
Actually, I don't think so. I think this debate, the larger debate about how the government accesses data, utilizes it, retains it, leverages it, I think is a critical debate. I think Teresa's point, and Teresa, thank you and your family for the service to this country. I think Teresa's point is an important one, though, because this leak comes amidst all the other scandals that were brewing, in a sense that Washington is not working. And I think, John, one of the things you'll see in terms of question of oversight of these kinds of programs is Congress really doing its job? Are they really understanding what's a part of these programs? Perhaps the intelligence committees are, because they're doing this day to day. But the other members of Congress that do have a responsibility on our behalf as American citizens to ensure that the executive and the U.S. government is not overstepping its bounds, are they doing their job? And you're going to start to see stories about, you know, how many of the senators or representatives have attended these briefings. Are they really asking the right questions? You know, the questions that date back to post 9/11. Do people remember the briefings that they got? Did they actually ingest what was happening? And so these are critical questions, because in a democracy we rely on not just the president and the executive, but on the Congress and the courts to make sure that they're overseeing, in particular, these kinds of programs that have this difficult balance between security and liberty.
I want to run through a couple of Twitter questions here for you fairly quickly in a row. First one is from Boring File Clerk. How did a high school dropout get paid $200,000 to work in Hawaii and manage our secrets? The real scandal here is government incompetence. Your thoughts?
That's a great question. I don't know enough about his background to comment specifically, but his access to this kind of data, the fact that he worked not only for a contractor at the NSA, but also worked at the CIA and had access to sensitive programs and information. That raises real questions about our security vetting processes and whether or not we have outsourced too aggressively elements of our national security, particular to private contractors. That's a debate you're starting to see even more vigorously now, but it's part of this broader debate about the national security establishment. So it's a good question.
Here's one from John. How could outside audits be used to increase trust in the NSA activities?
It's a great question. As I mentioned, the 2006 terrorist financing tracking program, we did in fact have outside audits. We had European auditors come in to give the Europeans comfort. And I think what you could do is not only have a greater sense as to what the controls are now, how the Inspector General, for example, at the NSA looks into this program and audits it, but also perhaps have an outside audit of the program. keep in mind, John, there's something called the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board that was started in the Bush administration, passed by Congress in the second term of the Bush administration. And that board is supposed to be doing this kind of oversight to make sure that the government, especially with these sensitive programs, is not overstepping its bounds. The Obama administration was criticized in its first term for not having anybody on that board. The board exists now. That's a potential body that could do the outside audit and report to Congress and the American people as to what's happening. You have to have these new kinds of structures, I think, to give greater comfort and visibility that this balance is being struck within the government.
And here's one from Monty on Twitter. Is there a way to make us more secure without paying the heavy price of undermining our constitutional rights and basic freedoms?
I think so. I mean, President Obama came in talking about the false choice between security and liberty. He's now sort of backtracked a little bit on that. But I don't think it's an all or nothing proposition. I think you can design these programs, especially in the era of big data, to ensure the government is actually doing this in a very targeted way, in a way that isn't just trolling and data mining and sort of the most sort of Big Brother-like elements that we can imagine. And so I think there are ways of designing these programs and then giving people visibility, giving us all visibility as to how they're being implemented to ensure that the government isn't overstepping. And to the extent that people overstep the bounds, that they're held accountable, that they're fired, that they're fined, that things actually happen to abuse of that kind of data and that kind of access.
Juan Zarate is a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where he works as a Transnational Threats Project senior advisor there. Also an author of a couple books, Forging Democracy, a comparative study on the effects of U.S. foreign policy on Central America democratization.
A mouthful.
And a new book coming out on September 10th, Treasury's War, The Unleashing of a New Era of Financial Warfare. What's that about?
That's about the last 12 years, the U.S. government's use of financial power and influence in national security, and really the story of how the Treasury Department, the group of individuals within it, as well as the U.S. government has really put financial power and influence at the center of our national security. Between diplomacy and military power, there's often not much in between. The U.S. government has devised new and aggressive ways to use financial power to drive our national security interests. And so the book's about that, and it's about what's to come next, especially with the rise of China and the lessons that we've taught others.
Out on September 10th. Back to the phones. Joe is waiting to talk to you from Ocracoke, North Carolina, on our Republican line. Good morning, Joe.
Good morning, sir.
Go ahead.
Good morning, sir.
Morning, Joe.
I'd like to ask the President, he raised his right hand and swore to uphold the Constitution, the senators, the congressmen, everybody raises their right hand and swear to uphold the Constitution. Then they turn around and go in the back room and make a deal to violate the Constitution for the greater good. Snowden broke the law. He should be put in jail. They broke the law. They should be put in jail. If a man's a murderer, you have a legal procedure to search him, to get the gun, to get the proof. If you don't follow the law for him, the Constitution for him, follow the Constitution, protect the immigrants when they don't have papers to do, you can't ask them.
So, Joe, are you saying that members of Congress broke the law? Explain that a little bit more.
Well, they all agreed to the program, to the Patriots Act, behind our back. Now they got caught breaking our constitutional law. Now they want to pass, but they want to hang the man that told on them.
Well,
I mean, we all need to
talk a little bit
looking.
about the Patriot Act. Did Congress break any laws in this act?
Well, certainly I don't think Congress broke laws in passing the Patriot Act or in the reauthorizations that have come since. But, you know, Joe raises an important sensibility here that, you know, maybe we're pushing on the bounds of the Fourth Amendment, you know, the prohibition on unlawful searches and seizures. And perhaps we need to recalibrate what that looks like in the era of big data and big technology and the ways that the government can access it.
How were those discussions handled in the Bush administration when you were there?
Well, all of this, in many ways, during the Bush administration was a work in progress and evolution. I think, you know, you need to think about the Bush administration in stages, because you had the immediate post-9/11 period, which was a period of not only deep shock, but also an attempt to understand what it was that was coming next. There was a deep sense of the unknown in terms of what al-Qaeda was doing and planning, what was possible. Remember, we had the anthrax attacks here. in Washington, throughout the country, right after as well. And so there was a sense of dread, a sense of needing to get as much information as possible and then to ensure that 9/11 never happened again. There was an evolution, though. There was an evolution through the second term of the Bush administration. I was fortunate and honored enough to serve in that second term. And what you saw was, by design and necessity, a recalibration of some of these practices, some by political pressure, some by diplomatic pressure, other by litigation, but a sense that we needed to recalibrate how we were doing this and set the long-term footing for our counterterrorism policies. At the heart of that was making sure that what we were doing was legal, making sure that it was defensible and understandable not only to the American public but to our friends and allies abroad, and to make sure that we had built programs that in the long term were going to keep America safe. And that's why when I left in 2009, one of my arguments for continuity in these policies was, look, you may oppose what happened in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, but what you have now is a very different set of systems for how we protect the country. And those balances have been drawn with legislation, with our counterparts abroad, and you're going to see that continuity. And I think the revelation that the Obama administration has largely continued with a lot of these practices and programs is you know, a manifestation of that continuity.
Ben is up next from Clayton, Louisiana, on our independent line. Good morning, Ben.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My question to good morning, Mr. Zarate.
Good morning, Ben. How are you, sir?
Pretty good. My question is, I used to drive a truck cross country, and I was about 15 miles when they hit the towers. After that, they made us go west. It came out that the NSA knew about that, and we were understanding from the state troopers that were pushing us west that
Ben, what are you saying the NSA knew about?
NSA knew ahead of time that this was going to happen. They had put out on the news, didn't have it out very long.
Are you talking about September 11th, Ben?
Mm-hmm. They put.
Well, hold off on the conspiracy theories of September 11th. Let's go to Elijah from Oceanside, California, on our Democratic line. Good morning, Elijah.
Good morning, gentlemen. How are you all doing today?
Good. Elijah.
My question obviously is for Mr. Zarate. Mr. Zarate, the government says that we shouldn't have a problem with what the NSA is doing if we do not have anything to hide. However, the government continues to classify information. As well as the lady who called earlier was mentioning that she has family that's military. I'm a military veteran. I served 4 years in the United States Marine Corps. Currently, with the budget deficits and everything, it's almost impossible for me to get benefits.
Elijah, you're going in and out a little bit. What's your question for Mr. Zarate?
My question is why should the American people be okay with the NSA doing wiretaps when the government continues to classify information?
Well, Elijah, it's a good question. I think, you know, there are some who think there should be no secrets in government at all. I think that's the sort of the Julian Assange extreme view. There are others who think we should classify everything and keep things under cloak. You have to have a balance here because the government has to be able to defend the country, and you cannot have sources and methods, battle plans, and how we gather sensitive intelligence. You can't have that on the front pages of the paper. Okay, that's a given. But you can't also have simply the American public being told you can trust us, especially when we understand that the data being acquired is mass in quantity with huge technology to be able to access it. And so there has to be a way of balancing here where the American public knows sufficiently what the program's about, but certainly has confidence in the oversight. And this is where the Congress, I think the President and the courts have a special role to play, and this is why I suggested to John here that we need to think about maybe other mechanisms that give the American public, give us all a sense that there isn't overreach. Because I would argue we need the NSA to be looking at this kind of data. We need to be able to target, to put the pieces together. To Ben's earlier call, part part of the problem with 9/11 was we didn't put the pieces of data together. We weren't doing the kind of deep analysis and cross-fertilization of information. That was what the 9/11 Commission said. And frankly, the 9/11 Commission argued for an information sharing environment that was wide and deep. And in some ways, what we've seen with the Bradley Manning case and with this case is perhaps too many people having access to too much information. And so there's a cross-current here.
That's a question for you. Some stats from Politico. There's about 5 million people in the United States who hold U.S. security clearances. About 71% of those hold lower confidential secret clearances. The remaining are the top secret folks. The Pentagon issues about 80% to military officials. Are you comfortable with that many people having access to our secret and top secret information?
I'm not. And you know.
Is there a right number?
I'm not sure there's a right number, but I think the Snowden leak here indicates that we've got to take a hard relook at how we give people, especially contractors, access to information. Now, contractors do great work for the country. I don't want to besmirch them. I've worked with them. I've seen their great work, and in fact, some of the oversight of these programs is done by outside contractors. So I don't want to besmirch the entire industry, but we have to rationalize who has access to what, and especially as we get to more and more sensitive programs where lives are literally at risk if the information gets out. That's information that needs to be closely held. And that's where the tension is, John. We need to be able to keep secrets, to be able to protect lives, to be able to do the work of defending the country properly. At the same time, we've got to have an open and transparent system where the American citizenry knows that the government isn't overreaching and isn't overstepping the bounds of the Constitution.
Juan Zarate is a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. You can see some of his work at csis.org. Also has his book, Treasury's War, The Unleashing of a New Era of Financial Warfare, coming out on September 10th. Thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, John. I appreciate it.
Here's what's happening in the Senate this afternoon. A couple of votes on judicial nominations expected at about 5:30 Eastern. Then more work on amendments to the immigration bill. While the Senate is considering those amendments to the bill, Congressional Quarterly writes that the Senate will also likely be asked to debate the confirmation of a new director to head the agency that carries out most of the nation's immigration laws. Immigration and Customs Enforcement Director John Morton announced today that he plans to retire and resign after leading the agency for 4 years. And we'll have live coverage tomorrow of the confirmation hearing of President Obama's nominee to be FCC Chairman, Thomas Wheeler. He'll testify before the Senate Commerce Committee at 2:30 Eastern on C-SPAN 3. Majority Leader Harry Reid has said he hopes to finish work on the immigration bill before the July 4th recess. As we wait for a senator to speak, we'll get an analysis of disaster relief spending from this morning's Washington Journal.
Segment of the Washington Journal, we take a look at how your money is being spent on a different federal program. And this week, with parts of the American West fighting large wildfires and the East Coast just over 2 weeks into the 2013 hurricane season, we'll take a look at federal disaster relief spending. And to do that, we're joined by Dan Weiss, a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, who co-authored a recent report on federal disaster spending over the last 3 years. And Mr. Weiss, start us off with the price tag on federal disaster relief spending over the last 3 years.
Thanks, John, and thanks for having me. We looked at federal disaster relief and recovery spending in fiscal years 2011, 12, and 13 and found combined that the federal government spent what we estimate to be $136 billion over these 3 years, or about $400 per household per year for disaster relief and recovery.
And the name of the report is Disastrous Spending. Federal disaster relief expenditures rise amid more extreme weather. For folks who want to follow along as we're going through this report, it's available online?
Yes, at AmericanProgress.org, and you can put in the title Disastrous Spending or my name, Daniel J. Weiss, into the search engine. It's pretty easy to find.
So we're talking about $136 billion over 3 years. You equate that to about $400 per household per year. Break those numbers down for us as we show a chart here on the different bills that you added up, the different appropriations and supplemental spending bills, and what they cost.
Well, first, it's important to note that the federal government itself does not have, as far as we could identify, an accurate tally on how much it spends on disaster relief and recovery. So we scrubbed the federal budget looking for every program that has some element of disaster relief and recovery in it. We found that there were 96 programs in 19 cabinet or official cabinet departments that had some element of disaster spending. Now, a lot of these received money only for the Superstorm Sandy Disaster Relief Act passed in Congress in January for things, for example, the FBI got money to replace some damaged facilities in northern New Jersey. And that's not typical. They don't typically receive disaster relief and recovery money. But nonetheless, this reflects the fact that we've had 25 disasters in the last 2 years that caused at least $1 billion in damage each, for a total price tag of $188 billion in damages just for these 25 extreme weather events. And this is what some people call the new normal.
As climate suspended.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I have one unanimous consent request for a committee to meet during today's session. It has the approval of the majority and minority leaders, and I ask unanimous consent the request be agreed to, printed in the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, last Saturday was the first anniversary of a very historic day. On June the 15th, 2012, President Barack Obama announced that he would grant temporary legal status to immigrant students who arrived in the United States as children. This status, known as Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA, allows these young people to live and work legally in America on a temporary basis without fear of deportation. June 15, 2012 is the day that I'll never forget. It was personal. It was 12 years ago that I'd introduced legislation known as the DREAM Act. This bill gives immigrant students who grew up in this country a chance to earn their citizenship. I've worked hard to pass this bill for 12 years, and during that time, it has been my honor to meet hundreds of the young people who would be eligible for the DREAM Act. I don't know when it started, but we've started calling them, and they call themselves, the Dreamers. They were brought to the United States as children. They grew up in this country, and they've overcome some amazing obstacles. They're tomorrow's doctors, engineers, teachers, soldiers. They're young people who will make America a better country. But for most of their young lives, they've been trapped in a legal limbo, fearing that they could be deported away from their families, away from their homes, away from the only country they've ever called home, with just a knock on the door. Yet they've developed amazing lives with great potential. We've already invested in them, incidentally. They're educated here in America, and they have a great potential to make this country even better for the future generations. It just doesn't make any sense to walk away from the so many talents that they can bring to us. In 2010, Senator Richard Lugar of Indiana and I joined together across the aisle to ask the Obama administration to grant deferred action to Dreamers. President Obama wanted to give Congress a chance to act before using his executive power, and he said, I know I have the authority, but let's see if you can pass the DREAM Act. Well, we brought it to the floor of the Senate. I remember that day, Mr. President, because it was a Saturday, if I'm not mistaken. That gallery was filled with young people in caps and gowns who were watching the debate on the floor of the United States Senate on the DREAM Act. We needed 60 votes because we faced a Republican filibuster. We've always faced a Republican filibuster. 55 senators voted for it, which by most standards is a sufficient majority, but not by the U.S. Senate standard. We fell short, 5 votes short of defeating a filibuster. I watched those students file out of those doors, and then I left the floor of the chamber, walked downstairs to meet with them. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. They had just watched their dreams disappear right here on the floor of the Senate. 5 votes short. You see, the House, which you were serving in, Mr. President, had already passed the DREAM Act. Under the leadership of Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Howard Berman, Zoe Lofgren, and especially my colleague from Illinois, Luis Gutierrez, you had risen to that challenge. We had our chance and fell short by 5 votes. After that Republican filibuster of the DREAM Act, President Obama decided that he needed to take charge. He established the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals to give those dreamers and thousands like them across the country a chance to come out of the shadows and be part of America. What has happened since then? In the last year, more than 539,000 have applied for DACA. So far, about 365,000 applications have been granted. 140,000 are still being considered. I'm proud to say my home state of Illinois has the 3rd most DACA applicants, more than 28,000, and the 3rd most DACA recipients, approximately 23,000 young people. It wasn't too surprising because shortly after the President announced this program, Congressman Luis Gutierrez and I held this kind of gathering at Navy Pier, which is kind of a seminal site in downtown Chicago. And we invited those who wanted to apply for this deferred action to come. We thought, you know, what are we going to do if 400 or 500 people show up? And then we're worried no one would show up. We didn't know what to expect. Well, we knew the night before what was coming. The line started forming at midnight. Midnight, these families stood there, mom, dad, and their son or daughter, waiting for a chance for that son or daughter to apply for this decision by President Obama of deferred action. Many times the parents were undocumented themselves and even risked deportation showing up. But the thought of saving a child and their family, giving that child a chance, was enough for them to take the risk. Well, it turned out over 12,000 people showed up. We were overwhelmed. We couldn't even come close to processing the applications that were involved. We knew then this was an idea whose time had come. It's especially important to note the one-year anniversary of President Obama's announcement as we consider what's going on the floor of the United States Senate this week. We're debating comprehensive immigration reform. The reality is that DACA is overwhelmingly popular with the American people. The American people, I have always trusted, have in their heart of hearts a goodness, an understanding, and a caring. They saw these young people brought here as babies, as infants, as little children, and they knew they'd not made the decision. Their parents made the decision to come here. If anybody did anything wrong and violated any law and overstayed a visa, whatever the circumstances, it wasn't the child. It was the parent. And they understand the basic element of justice, not just in America, but in life. And it's this: you don't hold a child responsible for the wrongdoing of a parent. Most Americans understood that and want to give these young people a chance. On Election Day last year, Hispanic Americans voted overwhelmingly in favor of President Barack Obama. There were many Republican members of Congress, including my good friend Senator John McCain of Arizona, who heard that message loud and clear. And that's in no small part why we're considering comprehensive immigration reform today. Because within this bill is the DREAM Act. Not just the DREAM Act, the strongest version of the DREAM Act that's ever been written. It's also important to note what happened to the Dreamers in the last year. These young Americans who are finally able to work legally in America have stepped forward to contribute their talents already. The Center for American Progress and the Bipartisan Partnership for a New American Economy has concluded that giving legal status to Dreamers will add $329 billion to America's economy and create 1.4 million new jobs by 2030. The economic benefit of legalizing 11 million undocumented could be even greater. According to a study by the Center for American Progress, if comprehensive immigration reform becomes law, undocumented immigrants will increase their earnings by 15% over 5 years, leading to $832 billion in economic growth, $109 billion in increased tax revenues, monies that will be paid by the currently undocumented immigrants who will become legally part of America in the next 10 years. It will also create an estimated 120,000 jobs every single year. It is a growth engine. It always has been a growth engine in America. This nation of immigrants, when it builds on the strength and commitment of newcomers, is a stronger and better nation and continues to lead the world. How could we have forgotten that lesson of history? Conservative economist Douglas Holtz-Eakin concluded that immigration reform would actually reduce federal deficits by $2.7 trillion, add a full point to our economic growth, and raise GDP per capita by approximately $1,700. You know, I started several years ago coming to the floor of the Senate, not just speaking about the DREAM Act, but telling their stories. It was something that I came to because I finally witnessed their courage and realized I had to share it here on the floor of the Senate. When I first started talking about the DREAM Act and undocumented young people who could be deported in a moment, torn away from their families and their lives, sent to a place they could never remember and facing a language they couldn't speak, they would very quietly wait until my meeting was over and come out in the darkness by my car as I'd go to leave meetings in Chicago and say, "Senator, I'm one of those kids who would be helped by the DREAM Act." They didn't want anyone to see them for fear of being deported. But over time, they came to realize that standing up with the courage to tell their stories, they risked deportation, but they put a face on this issue. It wasn't some politician giving a speech. It was a real life. And that's what they did. And as they came forward to tell their stories with their courage, I came to the floor of the Senate. I want to take a moment now to thank a man who's sitting to my right, Joe Zogby. Joe has been my staffer on this issue from the beginning. And when it passes, I know that he will celebrate it just as I do, understanding, as I do, the lives that will be impacted by this decision if the DREAM Act becomes the law of the land. These Dreamers are an amazing group. The stories that I told on the floor included Dreamers who grew up in 17 different states, from Arizona and Texas in the Southwest, Missouri and Ohio in the Midwest, North Carolina, Georgia in the Southeast. These talented young people came to America from all over the world, 19 different countries represented, and from every continent except Antarctica. Yet all of them share something in common. America is home. They're only asking for a chance to give back to their home. Today I want to spend a minute or two and update the Senate on what happened to some of these Dreamers since they received DACA, this deferred status, last year. Angelica Hernandez, brought to America when she was 9 years old. 2 years ago, Angelica graduated from Arizona State University, an outstanding senior in the mechanical engineering department with a 4.1 GPA. She just finished her first year of graduate school at Stanford University, where she's working on a master's degree in civil and environmental engineering with a focus on energy. Her dream is to dedicate her career to developing renewable energy. After receiving DACA, because of the President's executive order, this summer, Angelica will work at Enphase Energy, a solar energy startup company. This is Pierre Beristain. Pierre and his sister were brought to the United States from Peru in 1998 when they were children. Pierre didn't speak a word of English when he arrived in Texas, but he went on to receive a bachelor's degree with honors from Harvard University. He is currently pursuing a master's degree at Harvard's Divinity School. 2 years ago, Pierre co-founded the Restorative Justice Collaborative, a nonprofit organization which involves criminal offenders in the process of repairing the harm that they've done. Since he received DACA, Pierre was awarded one of only 10 Harvard Presidential Public Service Fellowships, so he can expand this organization. This is Carlos Martinez. Carlos and his brother were brought to the United States when he was only 9 years old. He graduated with honors with a Bachelor's of Science degree in computer engineering from the University of Arizona. Carlos received job offers from Intel, IBM, and many high-tech companies. But he couldn't work because he was undocumented. So he went on to get a master's degree in software systems engineering at the University of Arizona. After receiving DACA, Carlos is finally able to work in America as an engineer. This Wednesday, he'll start a new job with IBM, a company that first tried to hire him 6 years ago when he was undocumented. Out of more than 10,000 applicants who applied to IBM, Carlos Martinez was one of only 75 people that they hired. This is Nelson and John Magdaleno. They came to the state of Georgia from Venezuela. When Nelson was 11, John was 9. Nelson and John went to Georgia Tech University, one of the most selective engineering schools in America. Nelson graduated with an honors degree in computer engineering, and John is currently an honors student majoring in chemical and biomolecular engineering. After receiving deferred action, John is working in a biomedical engineering lab at Georgia Tech researching glaucoma, and he recently secured an internship with Eastman Chemical Company. Nelson is now working as a product engineer at Texas Instruments, one of America's top high-tech companies. Ola Queso, brought to the U.S. from Albania at the age of 5. What a superstar. Valedictorian of her high school class, she is now a pre-med student in the honors program at the University of Michigan. Her dream is to become a surgical oncologist. Can we use more of those? You bet. In 2011, I invited Ola to testify at a hearing on the DREAM Act. She was the first undocumented immigrant to openly testify before the United States Senate. It took amazing courage for this young woman. After receiving deferred action, this spring, Ola interned in the office of my colleague and friend, Senator Carl Levin. Here's someone that a few of those following the debate may recognize, Tolu Olabumi. Tolu Olabumi was brought to the United States from Nigeria when she was a child. In 2002, Tolu graduated with a degree in chemical engineering from Washington and Lee University in Virginia. For 10 years after graduating from college, Tolu couldn't work as an engineer. She spent her time working to pass the DREAM Act. Since receiving the deferred action, Tolu is working as an advocate for comprehensive immigration reform with the Center for Community Change. Last week, Tolu was introduced to America. She had the honor of introducing President Obama at a White House event on immigration reform. I met with the President last week. I asked him about those dreamers. And he said they came into the office, the Oval Office, and met with him, and he said there were tears in everyone's eyes as people realized the opportunity these young people might finally get if we pass comprehensive immigration reform. This is Erica Andiola, brought to our country from Mexico when she was 11 years old. Graduated with honors from Arizona State with a bachelor's degree in psychology, founder and president of the Arizona DREAM Act Coalition, an immigration group advocating for the passage of the bill. She received DACA and has since been working in Congress. She's the district outreach director for one of the Arizona delegation's newest members, Representative Kristen Sinema. And now I'd like you to meet Carlos and Rafael Robles. Carlos and Rafael were brought to the United States as children. They grew up in suburban Chicago in my home state of Illinois. They were both honors students at Palatine High School and Harper Community College. Carlos is now attending Loyola University in Chicago, majoring in education. With DACA, Carlos can pursue his dream to become a teacher, and he will have the opportunity to student teach at a suburban high school in the Chicagoland area. Rafael is at the University of Illinois in Chicago, where he's majoring in architecture. After receiving DACA, Rafael is working at Studio Gang Architects, an award-winning architecture firm in the great city of Chicago. And this is Jose Magana. Jose was brought to the United States from Mexico at the age of 2, graduated valedictorian in his high school, first member of his family to attend college. In 2008, he graduated summa cum laude from Arizona State University with a major in business management. Jose went on to graduate from Baylor University Law School. After receiving DACA, Jose began working with the Mexican-American Legal Defense Fund, a leading civil rights organization. And this week, Jose will be sworn in as a member of the bar, which he was unable to do before President Obama's executive order 1 year ago. Now, to hear the stories of these amazing young people is to realize the benefits that immigration has always meant for America. Imagine what will happen when 11 million undocumented immigrants have the opportunity to come out of the shadows and be part of America. Like these dreamers, they will be able to contribute even more to this country they worked so hard to come to and worked so hard to stay in and now call home. Legalization will open the earning potential for millions of people. They'll be able to pursue jobs to match the skills they have instead of working and being exploited in the underground economy. It's the right thing to do, and it will make America stronger. Mr. President, it was so disappointing last week that the Republicans in the U.S. House of Representatives passed an amendment to cut off funding for this program. That's right. All of these young people who've received a chance, the first chance ever to be part of America's future, would have the program shut down by a vote last week in the U.S. House of Representatives. Supporters of this amendment want to deport these young people. They make no bones about it. They believe that they should leave. Their belief is that if these dreamers are forced out of the country, deported to some other country, that we'll be a stronger nation because of that. What are they thinking? To lose people like Carlos Martinez and Tolu Olubunmi, these young people can make a difference, a positive difference for America. It is shameless, absolutely shameless, for those who play with the lives of these young people. These are people who need a chance. They don't need to be the victims of some political gambit. And it would be bad for America's future if they leave. We couldn't possibly be stronger if Angelica Hernandez could work on future renewable sources of energy, and Ola Queso could no longer be the researcher in cancer that she wants to be. The answer is clear. We need to pass comprehensive immigration reform on a bipartisan basis right here in the Senate. We have waited way too long. Over 25 years, this broken immigration system has not done these people justice, nor has it done America justice. In the next 2 weeks, the United States Senate will conclude one of its most historic debates on comprehensive immigration reform. It's been over 4 months that I've been actively involved in this gang of 8, 4 Democrats, 4 Republican senators. We've had over 30 sit-down meetings face-to-face. Many of them went smoothly. The discussion of the DREAM Act did. Some of them not so smoothly. We disagreed, and some of the disagreements were pretty vocal. At the end of the day, though, we realized that we had a larger responsibility that went beyond any single difference of opinion that we might have. We reached a bipartisan agreement. Now the question is, can the Senate hold that agreement together on the floor of the Senate when the amendment process begins, and next week when we face a vote? The values and principles that underlie this agreement are fundamental and critical. A path to citizenship, not only for these young people, but for many of their parents. They have to come out of the shadows, up to 11 million of them, identify themselves to a government that they have feared their whole lives. They have to register with this government and then submit themselves to a criminal background check. If they're found to have a serious problem in their background, they are gone. They don't have a chance to become legal in America. But if they pass that background check, they have to pay a fine, a substantial fine, and then learn English and be monitored during the course of 10 years. 10 years in probationary status. During that period, they can work legally in America, they won't be deported, and they can travel without fear fear of being stopped at the border. Then at the end of 10 years, if they've met all of the standards, all of the scrutiny, paid the fines and paid their taxes, they'll have a chance to be part of a 3 to 5 year path to citizenship. It is a long process. For many of them, it will be a great sacrifice. But they've offered great sacrifices with their lives already. On the other side of this, we have agreed with our Republican colleagues to do even more in our power to make sure that our border with Mexico is as strong as humanly possible, and to make certain that our immigration system is changed so that we don't face this debate every 5, 10, or 25 years. I think it's a good bill. There are parts of it that I'm very proud of. Some parts of it I just don't like at all. But that's the nature of a compromise. That's how you get something done. I look around this institution, I realize how important this issue is, but I also realize how important this issue is to the United States Senate. If I ask the people of America, what do you think about Congress these days? I think I know the answer. Somebody said our approval ratings just broke double digits again, Mr. President. We're up to 10% of the American people think we might be worth having. That must include a lot of our relatives and close friends, that we made 10%. We better prove something on the floor of the Senate over the next 2 weeks. We better prove that we can work together, Democrats and Republicans, that we won't break down and fall apart over one issue or the other, that we'll keep our focus on getting this job done. And then we need to turn to our colleagues and friends in the United States House of Representatives and tell them they face the same historic responsibility we face. I've heard a lot of speculation about what might happen in the House. Let's just focus on the Senate for the next 2 weeks. Let's do our part and do our job and let the American people witness this process as it should be. If we're successful at the end of next week and pass this legislation, then let the American people speak up. To the members of the House of Representatives, let them hear from their districts and the people they represent what they feel about the importance of this issue when it comes to immigration reform. I am confident, as I said earlier, that deep in their hearts, the American people are good people. They know our roots, they know our story, they know our origin. I stand here today as the son of an immigrant. My mother came to this country at the age of 2. She was a dreamer in her day. Her mom brought her to the port of Baltimore, put her on a train, and they linked up with my grandfather in East St. Louis, Illinois. Upstairs in my office is my mother's naturalization certificate. It's proudly displayed because I want people to know who I am and where I came from. It's my story, it's my family story, but it's a